Hi. Welcome to the Curry School of Education. Thank you for attending the Curry Research Lectureship Series. Series is sponsored primarily by the Virginia Education Sciences Training, or VEST, Predoctoral Fellowship Program, which is supported by the U.S. Department of Education Institute of Education Sciences. The VEST program applies rigorous research methods and analytic techniques in the social sciences to study school and classroom effects. I'm Julie Cohen, an assistant professor in curriculum and instruction and a VEST faculty mentor. Today, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Peter Youngs, who's an associate professor here at Curry. Prior to coming to UVA 2 years ago, Peter was on the faculty at Michigan State University for 9 years. Peter's published dozens of influential books and articles on the intersection of educational policy and teaching practices. In particular, his research is focused on the relationship between policy and practice in teacher education, induction, evaluation, and professional development. He's currently an editor at EPA, one of the most highly regarded journals in education policy. Peter and I, along with colleagues in Michigan and Connecticut, are just starting a longitudinal study of over 300 prospective elementary school teachers. Over the past year, working closely with Peter, I've learned that beyond these more readily apparent professional accomplishments, Peter is an engaged teacher, a generous mentor, and a tireless advocate for his students and his colleagues. Indeed, nearly all of his recent publications are co-authored by students, a sure sign of his commitment to apprenticing students into the world of rigorous educational research, one of the primary goals of the VEST program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Youngs.
Thank you, Julie. I would also just like to thank Jim and Sarah for the invitation to present this lecture. I'm going to start by just giving you a little background in terms of some research over the last few years on beginning teacher induction and teacher professional development. And I'll use that for a starting point to talk about 3 studies, one of which is finished and 2 of which are underway, which in different ways raise questions about the role of social context and how that is sometimes associated with key teacher outcomes. Feel free to raise questions as we go along or clarifications. We'll certainly plan to have some time as well just for open questions and discussion towards the end. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking to you about 2 studies that I was not directly involved with, but are helpful in terms of setting a frame for things I'm going to talk about. The first was led by Steve Glazerman and colleagues at Mathematica. Many of you are probably familiar with this study. It's a large-scale 3-year experimental study. It focused in particular on what we might think of as high-intensity or comprehensive or high-quality novice teacher induction programs. So these folks had a pretty significant grant from the U.S. Department of Education. They focused on more than 1,000 first-year teachers and followed them over 3 years. These were elementary teachers. They had a total of more than 400 schools, 418 elementary schools. And this was really focused on induction and mentoring for early care teachers in urban districts. So each of the schools in the study was assigned to the treatment or the control. It's important to be clear what the treatment was and how that was different from the control. For this study, the researchers spent time exploring 2 fairly prominent approaches to beginning teacher induction. One that was originally developed at Ed Testing Service, and another originally developed by the University of California, Santa Cruz New Teacher Center. So both of these treatments in different ways spent time training mentors. They selected as mentors people who had a lot of teaching experience, but they pulled them out of the classroom and they put them into the role of full-time mentor. So someone working for the ETS approach or the Santa Cruz approach would have had as many as 12 or 14, 15 first-year teachers, and they were really working as a full-time mentor. Both of these treatments called for the use of a formative teacher assessment, pretty regular observations by the mentor, as well as release time, both for the first-year teacher and for the mentor. Now, the control was not no mentoring. The control for this study was the type of mentoring that we would have seen in the 1990s, the early 2000s, and frankly, we continue to see in a lot of districts. So often, and many of you have taught and have experienced this, either as a mentor or as a beginning teacher, the teacher's assigned to someone, often from their school, who's working full-time as a teacher. There may be some training for the mentor in a lot of districts and states. There's minimal or no training. And then there may or may not be opportunities to work with a formative teacher assessment as part of the process, or for the mentor to be on a regular basis observing the beginning teacher. So we want to keep in mind for this study of the districts that participated, 10 of them sort of stayed with high intensity mentoring for 1 year. 7 of the districts stayed with high-intensity mentoring for 2 years. And let's just take a look at what the researchers found. And let me sort of point out a number of researchers and policymakers and certainly practitioners as of the late 2000s were very interested in the study, and including myself, made an assumption that there'd be some significant difference between these high-intensity programs and then the status quo, the way mentoring had traditionally been carried out. Researchers found for 3 main outcomes no differences between the effect of the high-intensity programs versus traditional mentoring on retention of these teachers after 1 year, after 2 years, after 3 years. They had a measure just in the first year where they collected classroom observation data as a research team on their literacy instruction. They didn't find significant differences in the literacy practices. For the districts that stayed involved with high-intensity mentoring for 2 years, the one notable, pretty important finding from this study was there was an effect for the teachers in the treatment in terms of their effectiveness with regard to math and literacy, but no effect if there were just 1 year of high-intensity mentoring compared to traditional mentoring, and as we can see, no effect on retention and literacy instruction. So I want to briefly talk about a second study, and then I'm going to come back for a moment to both of these. Another study to be mindful of was focused on practicing teachers. So this was carried out by Mike Garrett, Andrew Wayne, and colleagues at AIR, and they were looking at the role of professional development for middle school math teachers. This study focused on 179 teachers at 80 middle schools in the first year, and then roughly half of those teachers in schools stayed involved with the study in year 2. Similar to the Glazerman et al. Study, these teachers in schools were serving high percentages of low-income students, high percentages of racial minority students, and the researchers intentionally worked with pretty established professional development providers, America's Choice and Pearson Achievement Solutions. So the professional development consisted of summer institutes, a number of follow-up seminars, which is a key aspect of professional development, not to avoid it just being one shot or one experience, as well as instructional coaching in their schools. Let's take a look at what these researchers found. So no significant effects of PD on a number of outcomes of interest. The researchers had measures of teacher knowledge. They also had some measures of student achievement. The one area where they found some effects of PD were on changes in math instructional practice after the first year, and that was with the slightly larger group. Okay, so if anyone feels like sharing for a moment or two, what do you think is going on with these studies? These are well-designed studies. These are researchers who did not have an axe to grind as they went in. They started the studies, and a number of people in the research policy communities sort of had certain expectations about what they would find, and instead, in a number of cases with these 2 studies, we did not sort of find a significant effect of the treatment. Any thoughts about what might be going on, either the induction study or the PD study? Now, they're not all going to volunteer at once, but I see a hand. Go ahead.
The Glazerman piece. I didn't know it was on microphone. Now I'm nervous. The Glazerman piece, those are dealing with outside people, correct?
I'm sorry?
The people giving the professional development and the inductions.
The mentors may not have
from outside
had anything to do with the Beginning Teacher School, so good point. They were from the same district, but may not have previously worked in theirs.
Whereas the who was it? Ingersoll and May, their professional development, when they were looking at the SAS, they found that everybody seemed to do better when they had somebody in their own.
Okay, so here's someone who knows the research a little bit. There's a pretty significant study
but it doesn't
by
sound
Tom
like
Smith and Richard Ingersoll using schools and staffing survey, which would have focused, for the most part, its nationally representative data on the mentors in the control group in the Glazerman study, and did find more of an effect there. So Frank, who I know and I've had in class, is raising the issue. Sometimes it makes a difference for the mentor to have already been worked in the Beginning Teacher School or to know the Beginning Teacher School context. Any other thoughts about what's going on here? I did not plant Frank with that question, by the way.
I think it's more complicated than the researchers thought.
Okay. So there's some other things going on. Yep, absolutely. Okay, so this is just a little thing to get started. I do want to point out that one person who had a reaction after the first of these 2 studies was the lead PI, Steve Glazerman. His comment was, he said, I frankly would like to know what else is going on in these teacher schools. The nature of the contract with U.S. Department of Ed and the research design did not call for collecting data on principals or collecting data on other individuals in the Beginning Teacher School. Okay, so in my talk today, I'm going to spend time introducing 3 ways of conceptualizing and measuring social context and thinking about ways that it may possibly be associated with or sometimes have a causal association or relationship with key teacher outcomes. So one thing we'll do is we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about, from the perspective of the focal teacher, how social context may matter. Spend a little bit of time looking at data on teachers' social networks in ways in which that may be relevant for early care teachers, and then raise the question of how, for pre-service candidates or early care teachers, their own characteristics, their own qualities may interact with opportunity to learn aspects of their institutional or school context. Okay, so the first study I want to spend some time talking about drew on survey data from Michigan and Indiana. In this study, I worked with a colleague who's now at Michigan State, Ben Koginski, as well as a co-PI and co-author, Ken Frank. We were interested in examining teacher-level associations between measures of the novice teachers' perceptions of collegial climate in their schools and then their intended career decisions, sort of their commitment to their school or their planned retention decision. And we focused on 3 aspects of what we describe as collegial climate, the degree of professional fit between the teacher and others in their school, the level of relational trust across staff in the school, and the degree of collective responsibility in the school. To give you a little bit of background, we know from a number of studies that several different factors can affect teacher job attitudes, commitment levels, and turnover. These include student-teacher characteristics, the support of administrators, and other sort of key leaders in the school or district, as well as economic factors. As I've hinted at by referring to the Glazerman study as well as Smith and Ingersoll, we have sort of mixed findings or indeterminate findings in terms of effects of mentoring. And I went into the study with my colleagues making the assumption that if we looked hard enough, we had a number of different ways to measure the characteristics of mentors or the nature of mentoring practices, we would expect to find some association between mentor/mentoring and either commitment levels of novice teachers or retention decisions. But other factors are really important here. So we want to think a little bit about the interactions that novice teachers have with others in their school. Through these interactions, norms or expectations for how to teach, for how to handle student behavior, for how to interact with other teachers can be communicated. Also through these interactions, novices potentially can create subgroups or networks that can be useful to them. We do know from some of the research on early career teachers that opportunities to collaborate with colleagues are often associated with retention. And we want to be mindful that novices themselves are, especially when they start their first year in a school, their first year in the profession, constantly making judgments, evaluating the collegial climate in a number of ways. This can come through formal relationships with mentors, but often it will also come through informal associations or networks with others in their school. Okay, so I have a handout, and I think I've got about enough copies for one every 2 or 3 people. The first page of the handout actually just includes survey items for 3 of the key constructs: professional fit, relational trust, and collective responsibility. I want to spend a little bit of time just giving you a sense of the design of the study. We focused on 11 districts in Indiana and Michigan. By the standards of those 2 states, these were all roughly medium-sized districts. They served 10 to 20,000 students, K through 12, and had moderate to high levels of poverty. Most of the districts served students, 30% to 60% of whom were eligible for free and reduced lunch. We've sometimes presented this research to educators from California. They say those are not large districts by California standards, but by the standards of Indiana and Michigan, these would be medium-sized to large districts. Detroit was not in our study, Indianapolis was not in our study, but they were fairly large districts. The main approach to data collection in the study is we administered surveys to teachers who were in their first, second, or third years in the profession. We focused on general education teachers who were teaching elementary or middle school. As part of the study, we were interested in collecting data on the teachers' egocentric social networks. So we asked them if they had a formal mentor, and to identify that person, we also asked them about other individuals at their school who served as key resources. And we administered surveys to those folks to learn about their commitment levels, about their approaches to teaching their subjects. So this slide just provides a little bit of information about our variables of interest. I think one thing to bring out here is this measure of commitment, and it's referred to here as intent, sort of intent to remain teaching in one school. The survey asked the question, would you prefer to continue working in your school in 1 year from now? And also, could you see yourself working in the same school in 5 years? And we use the average of these two measures as a way of talking about the early care teacher's intent to remain teaching, or what we also describe as commitment. Let me just see if you want to raise any questions at this point. Not remembering off the top of my head, my sense is some of these people are second and third year, and sometimes with our models we looked at any differences between first year versus second and third year, but some of them have sort of decided to stay in the same school, and so that might have reduced it a little bit. I think just looking at the first year teachers should be more likely to see the wider standard deviation. Emily?
Fit with other teachers in your school versus the school mission or the school population?
Yeah. So we have to be a little bit careful because we use the term professional fit in this article, and we're not referring to fit with the job, which is not your question. The handout lists the items we look at, and the way we've defined it is to focus primarily on sort of their perception of how other teachers relate to them or they relate to other teachers. So to what extent do I matter to other teachers? To what extent do other teachers matter to me? To what extent do people take my ideas seriously? A different set of questions might ask about, are you connected to or feel committed to the mission of the school or the main goals? Any other questions at this point? Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time just walking through the models and explaining what these are getting at. The first model is identifying the distribution of variance among teachers and between schools in the study. We found approximately 70% of the variance was among teachers, while the remaining 30% was between schools. The next model, and I'll come back and talk about this a little bit more with our findings, is just a teacher level analysis trying to understand for all the early care teachers in the school what's the association between, for example, their perceived level of fit and their commitment level, or their own perceived level of collective responsibility in the school and their commitment level. The group level analysis is meant to take advantage of the fact that there's other people in the early care teacher school who are participating in our study. So in some cases, it's only the mentor or one or two members of the social network who've agreed to complete surveys. In a few cases in this study, there was more than one early care teacher from the same school. So what we're doing in the group level analysis is calculating group level means from a given school for these same constructs: fit, collective responsibility, and relational trust. The model that focuses on prior intent is very similar to the previous model, except it includes a measure for the early care teacher, their prior level of commitment. And so this model's identifying associations between the independent variables and change in intent to remain teaching over the course of the school year. What do we find? So I'll walk through this starting with Model 2. Again, this is examining teacher-level associations between the novice's perceptions of fit or collective responsibility or relational trust. The coefficients here for fit and collective responsibility were positive and statistically significant. In the third model, when we added the group level means, this raised the question of perhaps it's not so much the individual teacher's sense of fit or their own perception of collective responsibility that drives commitment, but it may simply be that you're in a school where many people have a high level of commitment, that many people feel that there's a high level of collective responsibility. But in fact, after controlling for the group level means, we did find that the individual teacher's perception of fit and collective responsibility continued to be associated with commitment. So for Model 4, this is when we add the prior measure of commitment, and what we found there is that the coefficients only for professional fit were remaining significant, and we use that to create the best fitting model, which is here in Model 5. I'm not going to say a whole lot more about this, but if you want to raise questions. Sarah.
I'm curious about the fit not coming through here where the trust, when you look at the fit mean, when you look at the trust mean and the collective mean, you look at the trust mean but not the fit mean. And I'm wondering about the fit question
This one?
and whether there's something about like the acceptance of diverse views or something that is tied into that. That I'm curious about the variability and what that means. So you're seeing it at the individual level mattering, but at the overall group level not mattering. And I'm wondering about whether there are some places where there's like a little feeling of like, oh, we all fit together, we're all in a group, you know, whereas, but some teachers feel isolated from that. I'm just curious about your observations about
Okay, so good point. So one of the things here is that and I think it's something we could go back and look at a little bit more closely, when we're calculating the group mean, we haven't done a careful job of distinguishing between, for a given ECT, what's leading to that group mean. So I was mentioning this a moment ago, but in one school, it might be that the only person who completed the survey and stayed in our study, in addition to the ECT, is a formal mentor. And the effect of the group mean may be different when we're thinking about who you have a formal relationship with, whereas in a different context, it might be that there's 3 people you identified as key colleagues, these people in your ecocentric network. They're not formal mentor, you don't already have a formal relationship with them, but the way the group mean plays out may be different there. And the fact that at least in some schools, some of the other people who we draw in data for the group mean are early career teachers, that's actually a third way of thinking about that. So part of the issue is that our overall, and once we're looking at the social network data, is that's what your question pushes me to think about. Could the different people contributing to that affect us in different ways?
Okay.
Jim?
So I'm looking at perhaps the last 2 models, 4 and 5, where you've included prior intent. So, sorry. So when you do that, you're basically getting identification for the other parameters off the change, people who change their intent. And I'm wondering, I want to make sure I recall what intent is. Is it intent to stay in teaching or intent to teach in this school?
It's intent to remain in the same school. So we're defining commitment here as sort of a commitment to the organization versus commitment to the profession.
But could you, yes, thanks, that's helpful. And then getting back to the inclusion of prior intent, could you talk a little bit about how you interpret that and how many people actually change intent one year to the next, which is, I mean, you're losing this collective, the significance of the collective goes away when you do that, right? And so I'm wondering how you're sort of interpreting that.
Right, okay. So I think one of the important aspects of having the measure of, the prior measure of commitment, or what's described here as intent to stay in the same school, is it's allowing you in some sense to control for some of the differences among teachers in your sample at the time the prior was collected. So that helps you. Another thing to add here is that once you're looking at change, and many of these people are 2nd and 3rd year teachers and they already have sort of pretty stable attitudes with regards to this question, across the entire sample, which was more than 100 early career teachers, is in the range of 150, 175, you're not seeing high levels of change. And so what we're sort of arguing with the last 2 models is if you still have an association for professional fit or any of the other predictors, then you can be fairly confident in it because you've added this prior and you don't have a significant amount of change for most of the teachers. Am I addressing your question? Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, thanks.
Is there another question? David.
I was wondering about your school attributes and what you included there.
Mhm.
Thanks. Going back to the question of about a third of the variance was between schools and whether how you, and I assume that accounted for your presenting the models in this way, focusing on individuals. What did you include in school attributes, and was there any indication that that might contravene this approach?
Okay, so I'll take your question in 2 ways. When we were looking at the variance components, we're really just interested in the question of, is most of the variance with regard to intent to stay in your school or commitment level variance that we find across teachers in the same school when we have evidence of that, or is most of it going to be between schools? In terms of the school characteristics, we would have had measures of the race ethnicity of the students, the SES of the school. I don't think we had a lot of others. We may have had some measures of sort of gender of the teaching staff. I'm not sure we had measures of the ELL population, but the school characteristics would have been there more as controls. Am I answering your question? Okay, so that's a good question. I think what we're arguing here is that the association between fit and commitment is sort of above and beyond that. So if we were to look closely at some of the aspects of the schools, they may have been associated with commitment, but what we're really trying to do is just control for those possible effects. So implications, we argue that it's important when we're thinking about early career teachers to not just focus on the formal relationship with the mentor or other formal relationships, but to consider this notion of fit with other teachers in the school, or more broadly, fit with the school context. There's some evidence of the importance of collective responsibility, and one of the takeaways for our group is that perceptions of fit and collective responsibility are shaped both by your formal interactions with your principal, with a mentor, as well as informal interactions with colleagues. I briefly want to mention a few extensions of this work. One of my former doctoral students at Michigan State, Aaron Grogan, did a dissertation on person-organization fit and teacher retention, and was really sort of from our group the first person to delve into this literature. Some of you may know this. Research outside of education, organizational psychology, has looked at questions of fit in various employee outcomes for a long time. And so this is just sort of an understudied area in education, and there's a lot of sort of different ways to build on the work here. With colleagues here at UVA, as well as Aaron, we've gone to use data from the Schools and Staffing Survey to look at questions about the association between fit and retention for a nationally representative sample. And we've also worked on a research review, just looking at research in and outside of education on fit and employee commitment and retention. Julie? Okay. Well, let me back up. One of the things I want to bring out, and then I'll answer your question, is are there possible policy implications for knowing that fit may have strong relationships with retention? One is to think about what happens at the stage of just recruiting and people learning about job opportunities, and people in a school or district, such as a principal or other teaching staff or even an HR director, knowing some things about the candidates. So I think that there's certainly room from the standpoint of research and policy to be looking closely at sort of that process. There's also the question of once someone's in a school, what are sort of the aspects of their teaching or their own characteristics that make them more or less likely to fit well, and can that possibly be changed? Can there be ways through mentoring or other support to help someone feel a stronger sense of fit? Your question is really bringing it down to the individual and sort of the question of what they might want to know or what might make it more likely. So this gets at the whole idea, and again, we see this from outside K-12 education and not as much research and work inside education, the idea of a realistic job preview. In the process of applying for this job, being interviewed for it, maybe doing a visit on site, have you learned some things that give you a sense of what the culture of that school is like, what some of the tendencies of some of the faculty are, what some of the norms or even tensions or factions would be? So this notion of a realistic job preview is one thing that can really help the individual get a better. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do well or thrive or be happy, but it could increase the likelihood that there's a good match there. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears and talk to you a little bit about a study I've been working on for about 12 months with colleagues at Michigan State. In this work, we are examining how early career elementary teachers' social networks are associated with their mathematics instruction. And I just want to acknowledge my co-PIs, Ken Frank and Kristen Bieda, as well as Serena Salome. And during the current school year, we're in the second year of the study. So in this study, our main research question is focusing on how 150 early career teachers draw on and are affected by their school-based social networks as they respond to multiple institutional pressures in teaching mathematics. And as no doubt almost all of you are aware, key institutional pressures in 2015 would include the Common Core state standards in most states, as well as changes in teacher evaluation. We focus on ambitious math instruction based on research indicating that math instruction that addresses both procedural fluency and conceptual understanding contributes to student learning. In particular, in this study, we are very interested in the role of mathematical knowledge for teaching. We expect that strong mathematical knowledge for teaching will help early career teachers integrate both their knowledge of math content with local knowledge of students, curriculum, the school context. Prior research documents relationships between teachers' MKT and both high-quality math teaching and students' math learning. So mathematical knowledge for teaching is important. Some might argue necessary to support ambitious instruction in mathematics. Many early career teachers will acquire mathematical knowledge for teaching to some extent during pre-service preparation, but they must continue to develop this. This is something that they refined. Again, it's based in part on their local context after they become teachers of record. So the question would be, what are some potential sources of MKT for beginning teachers? And one is certainly trial and error. You know, the way a number of us refine our teaching practices and acquire more knowledge is simply through teaching. This is also a very sort of time-intensive and frustrating process. So we would think also about the potential role of external professional development and the role of networks or resources within the school. I know some of you are already familiar with this distinction. In this study, similar to the previous study I was discussing, we focus on egocentric social networks. From a research standpoint, this means for the focal people in your study, asking them directly who their key resources are, and then going through a process where you collect data on those individuals. A sociometric approach would be different. It would sort of say at the outset, we're interested in this small number of schools, and we'll try to collect data from everyone in the school, and then look at how people communicate with each other, what relationships are happening. So this study, like the previous one, focused on egocentric networks. Does anyone want to raise a question, clarify that distinction? Okay, so I, on the second page of the handout, have a clearer version of this diagram. This gives you a sense of our conceptual framework. And the second part of the handout actually has two diagrams. So the top of that page actually just expands on what you see here. It's our way of thinking about associations between planning and enactment of math instruction and how math knowledge for teaching may contribute to both of those. This framework is just basically arguing that there are certainly relevant external institutional forces, Common Core state standards, teacher evaluation reform, we can nominate others, but also when we're really trying to understand for an individual factors that may shape their planning as well as their enactment of math instruction, we would think a little bit about norms and expectations in their school, and we would also think a little bit about potential resources can be thought of as social capital. Let me see if you want to raise any questions when you're looking at this. Okay, so I'm just going to go over a few of our hypotheses as we have been going into the study. We have many more hypotheses related to factors that might affect actual instructional practice, but for planning, as we go into the study, we are sort of expecting that school-based norms regarding the Common Core math standards will have a significant effect on early career teachers' planning of math instruction. And then for enactment, I'll just let you read through these hypotheses, but in different ways we're trying to think about how characteristics of the focal teacher as well as aspects of their social network may shape their enactment of math instruction. Jim.
Well, while we're reading, could you tell us a little more about what you mean by norms, school-based norms?
Okay, so we in the study are attempting to collect data from the formal mentor for the early career teacher, if there is one. And we're also interested in collecting data from the people the early career teacher identify as sort of key resources, what we're defining as members of their egocentric social network. We then go and survey them, and we ask those individuals some things about their own planning of math instruction, their own math instructional practice. So we're relying on self-report by formal mentors and other school-based colleagues to get some sense of those individuals' teaching practices, and then we're making the argument that that is a way of thinking about norms. We're also collecting data from the math instructional coaches and the principals, math instructional coaches, if applicable, that work with these early career teachers. And so we're thinking of norms for those folks less as teaching, because many coaches don't teach and principals for the most part don't teach, but more the surveys of those individuals are asking questions about general expectations for teachers' math instruction. And we're using the data on sort of the principal or instructional coaches' reported expectations for math instruction as a way of thinking about norms. Wait.
So I was wondering, I don't have a lot of experience with this, but can you talk a little bit about, like, how does this play out in a school in terms of, you know, like, I think about sort of math classes that I teach, and it's hard to, like, in terms of actually gaining that knowledge, that's mostly through coursework.
Right.
In terms of teaching other people, that's a very time-intensive process. So how
Right.
does the social interaction?
Right. And just in terms of the beginning part of your question, your frame of reference is sort of a university level instructor?
Well, that's for me, yes.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, how
What
does
this
this
might
happen
mean.
in elementary school?
Yeah.
Like, what does
Okay.
this mean?
So we might think of in many elementary schools that if you're teaching 4th grade or you're teaching 1st grade, you are part of a grade team. Okay. And there's often, but not always, regularly scheduled times where you're going to meet with other members of the grade level. Now, many of the people in this room have taught, just because the grade level is meeting once a week or 2 or 3 times a month, doesn't mean that the focus will be on curriculum or it'll be on instruction. It might be on the movie that someone saw the previous weekend or how the sports team's doing, that sort of thing. I think one of the things we've seen with the move in many districts towards having instructional coaches and sort of deploying them is that one of the ways to sort of have grade teams focus on instructional issues is from time to time an instructional coach be part of those meetings or to direct those meetings. There's also things we might think about where somebody's in their 1st or 2nd year, all the things they're teaching are still somewhat new to them. They may just identify somebody who other people in the school say, that's the person who knows math. I'm teaching 2nd grade, but people have told me, go talk to the 5th grader and 5th grade teacher, and she's willing to make time for this, and that's potentially a way. Am I answering your question a little bit?
Yeah, so they would exchange possible lesson plans or talk about fractions in a deeper way that might.
How did you teach this lesson? Why did it not go well? If you're going to get ready to teach this lesson again at some point in the future. So the way we're handling, so I think a different design would have been as much as possible to try to have the same math curriculum or 2 math curricula represented. We struggled a lot last year to recruit early career teachers to participate in the study, and this year we're in roughly 8 districts. They're in Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois, and there's probably going to be at least 4 or 5 different math curricula represented. So our main approach at this point is to collect information about what the math curriculum is, and then try to look as we have data on 125, 150 early career teachers, does that actually seem to drive this more than some of the other things? But I have colleagues here and colleagues at Michigan State who would say, you're looking at the wrong thing, go start with the curriculum, and that's really going to affect this more than social networks. Sarah?
You might have said this, and sorry if it's already been said, but how are you operationalizing ambitious math instruction?
Oh, okay. That's quite right. So I gave a quick definition that math instruction that addresses both procedural fluency and conceptual understanding. That's a very broad way of talking about this. So another way to think about the answer to your question is, what's the observation tool, observation instrument that we're using? And we, when we wrote the proposal and started the study, worked with something developed at University of Pittsburgh, Instructional Quality Assessment, the IQA. And it had been developed for use at the middle school level, and it also, frankly, had been developed for use in conjunction with professional development for experienced middle school teachers. So as we, first of all, struggled with getting a sample of 100 or more early career teachers in our first year, and so it was probably a blessing in disguise we only had 40 or 50 participants, because the IQA did not work very well, and we spent a lot of time in the first year of the study last year sort of taking a step back and sort of saying, what would another observation instrument be that might work better? So we're moving now to something called True Math. It was developed by Alan Schoenfeld and Bob Floden, and in different ways it sort of unpacks these notions of focusing on conceptual understanding or procedural fluency. And I'm happy to share the tool with you. I don't have a slide on sort of the specific ways it gets at this. But we spent a lot of time, we've trained a number of postdocs and a couple of assistant professors and graduate students to use this tool, and we keep coming back to, is this a appropriate way of getting at this broad construct of ambitious instruction? So we're still sort of wrestling with that. Go ahead. No, you got the microphone, good.
Did you have any hypotheses about the relationship between the administrators of the school and the ambitious math instruction? And what that
Okay,
relationship
I'm
looked
glad you
like?
asked the question. So one thing that I sort of didn't address directly in the earlier part of the talk is we know, and some of this is from Jim and colleagues' work, that principals actually are a big factor in beginning teacher retention. My colleague, who I've collaborated with both on this study and the previous study, is a sociologist, Ken Frank. So 10 years ago, he would have said, don't include data on them at all. Principals are either really good or really bad. I don't like leadership, I like social context. So because one of the main findings from the previous study that I didn't present here got at sort of perceptions of principal leadership and perceptions of the quality of relationships between principals and school staff, and found that that also contributed to commitment as well as fit contributed to commitment, we are building in some data on principals. I sort of mentioned earlier with the question about norms or expectations, we're surveying them directly, and we're asking some questions, not asking them to comment on Julie is a participant in our study, and what would you say about her, but asking them to speak more generally about their expectations. And the other thing I don't think I've brought out yet, we're still talking about the hypotheses, I haven't gotten to a slide on design. We are actually collecting data on the math knowledge for teaching of the principals, the formal mentors, the other social network members. And so it's a way to get a sense of, is someone potentially able to serve as a resource if they have high or low MKT. Does that answer your question? You want to follow up? Yeah. Okay.
Could I ask?
Oh.
Just the.
Thank you very much. So,
Sorry. Could I
oh,
ask
another
just-
question. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. So it seems to me your model is really great at organizational dynamics, but your research question is about institutional pressures. So I'm wondering, is there something coming up maybe that talks about that boundary of how the institutional pressures translate into organizational dynamics, or is that?
Okay. Help flesh out, if you could flesh out your question a little bit more. The way we are thinking about the pressure is we're defining it as the norm as measured by the mentor or the colleagues in the network report to us about their math teaching practice, or the principal reports to us about their expectations for their teacher's school. Are you getting at something that would be a little bit different than that?
Right, because your original question was asking, in my thinking, would be asking about Common Core standards or teacher evaluation, external. And I would consider those as institutional pressures, meaning the institutional environment of rules, norms, expectations from the outside. And what you've defined as more the organizational connections inside the building. And so what I was looking for is the boundary.
I got it, yeah, great question. So you're getting at the way I've been influenced a lot by this person I've collaborated with, Ken Frank, the way he and I tend to think. And the role of Common Core is potentially really salient here. The role of what's happening with teacher evaluation in your district. Is it only based on classroom observations? Is student growth or value added part of this? Is that sort of shaping decisions you make about teaching? So I think the best way to answer your question is the surveys, and we're also doing interviewing with the early career teachers, is a way to sort of ask very specifically, what are the factors that shape your planning? What are the factors that shape your teaching? And we think that'll help us understand some things about Common Core. The first year of data collection, we did not really build in specific ways of looking at the possible association or impact of teacher evaluation. And so one of the doctoral students for their dissertation has helped us extend the surveys of the early care teachers and their mentors and colleagues with a number of questions about teacher evaluation. It's, we think, absolutely a relevant part of the context, but it's not actually, it's sort of, I started off by talking about that, but we're really interested in the norms and really interested in sort of the specific resources as well. Okay, this tells you a little bit about our sample. These are not the same districts from the previous study, but they have similar characteristics. And we are aiming for a sample of roughly 125 to 150 teachers. And it's the second year of our study, so the teachers who are participating are in their first 4 years of teaching. One thing we'll have to look at is whether there's some significant differences between first-year teachers and those with other experience, or maybe between first and second-year teachers, first and third and fourth-year teachers. So each early career teacher completes 3 surveys. The fall and spring survey basically get at the same questions, but we're looking at these questions 6 months apart. There's items on their planning of math instruction. There's items on their teaching of math lessons, a number of questions about interactions with mentors and colleagues. We have a number of items here about the individual's sense of efficacy with regard to teaching math, also their identity and beliefs with regard to teaching math, and items on their perceptions of collective efficacy in their school and general teaching efficacy. And we administer a Math Knowledge for Teaching survey midway through the school year. One of the things we've found is that this is a survey that is very challenging, whether you're a first or second year teacher or an instructional coach, or you're working at UVA trying to fill out the survey and just trying it. So we really, after having recruited people to be in the study and we've spent time observing them, we have to spend time talking to them about the fact that this is a really challenging survey. We really don't expect anyone to get all the questions right. And it just raises some questions about challenges in administering that survey. So this picks up on what Sarah was asking. The early career teachers will participate in a total of 4 classroom observations, 2 in the fall, 2 in the spring. And this brings out a little bit of the areas that True Math focuses on. It is resource intensive. Julie and others here know this. Sarah's certainly aware of this, to train people, to calibrate them, to go and have them collect data. So Makopi said, why don't we also just collect observation data on the mentors and the colleagues? And that's when there was a strong reaction that it's just plenty to collect observation data on the early career teachers. So each social network member will complete 2 surveys this year, and this gives you a sense of items on the social network member survey. It's really meant in a lot of ways to mirror the early career teacher survey, and I mentioned this earlier, but the social network members are asked to complete a Math Knowledge for Teaching survey. This tells you a little bit about our analytic strategies. The main outcomes will be both the early career teachers' planning of ambitious math instruction and their enactment of such instruction. We're sort of hedging our bets here a little bit. It may be, especially for first-year teachers, that they do a number of thoughtful things in their lesson plans, but are still sort of developing skills at executing those lesson plans. This sort of lays out a model for what we'll be focusing on, and the handout includes the model as well as just ways in which we'll have variations on the model. So I'll just go over a few of these, but we could use the term colleagues' mathematical instructional practices to represent their own math instruction, as well as their expectations for early career teachers. I think one of the things that we got feedback on, this is the final point, is that it's important to actually look at the interaction of colleagues' MKT and their math instruction as a possible influence, and not just sort of look at those separately. See if you want to raise any questions. Vivian?
Do you have a sense of how stable are these characteristics from year to year, even within a year, given that, school environments can change fairly quickly?
Yeah, and is it sort of a broad question about a number of the different variables that are at play here?
Yeah.
So our sense is, with Math Knowledge for Teaching, it's probably pretty stable for people who've been teaching, the mentor teacher, the colleagues, the instructional coaches, probably the principals. For early career teachers, we're interested in administering the MKT measure at multiple points. That could evolve. We're sort of expecting that there'll be some change with our key outcome, that people will get better at planning, that they'll get better at teaching, and we're interested in whether that's a function of just their own characteristics or the curriculum. This is Julie's question. Or is there some things about the characteristics of the social network that may be driving that may be associated with that? Are there other variables as well in addition to the MKT?
Yeah, I guess I wonder if, thanks. So in terms of these sort of context variables and networks, how much change there is sort of even within the year and then across the years, but then I wondered if maybe you could leverage that variation in some way to look at sort of, diff and diff kind of analysis to look at how this might impact teachers differently?
Right. So great question. So I think a potential advantage of sociometric data, if it's collected at more than one point in time, is you are basically following a lot of the same people. A challenging thing here, especially for first and second year teachers, when you ask them on a fall survey and then towards the end of that first or second year on a spring survey who their key resources are, that may change a little bit. And our design has been to start with the people who are identified in the fall and then try to survey them in January, February, or March. And someone in April, at the end of their first year of teaching, may say, my social network's a lot different. The only way we'd be able to go and collect data on individuals at that point would be the following year of the study. It's just not, it's not set up to sort of go. So it's a great point, and to the extent that the network changes a little bit, and we are lucky enough that someone else nominated some of those people who are in your spring network, we might have data on them, but our design is, it's not adept at sort of getting at the change. It possibly gets it a little bit from one year to the next, but less so within the year. Other questions? Okay, so I've alluded to some of these already. I'm just going to mention a few challenges, and I'm also curious to hear reactions to what we're doing in this study. So we got the word that this study was going to be funded by the William T. Grant Foundation in March of 2014. It was the same week that the state of Indiana announced that they were dropping the Common Core state standards. And based on previous experience studying beginning teacher commitment and retention, we had recruited districts in Indiana, and we felt that they were particularly good districts to work with. There's usually good participation rates. There's support for the type of research that we're interested in. So we sort of panicked. We said we can probably have enough districts and teachers from Michigan and Illinois. You know, what does this mean? Well, lo and behold, fast forward 9 or 12 months, Indiana is not using officially the Common Core state math standards, but Bill Schmidt and others have done analyses of Indiana standards, and they're 95% or higher, similar to the Common Core. So it's really just a change in name, and that's allowed us to continue generally to have a focus on this. One of the things that we started off assuming was that people would just welcome us into our schools, and we got a little bit of feedback from members of our advisory panel that from the standpoint of an early care teacher, especially a first year teacher, if their only connection to the study is someone shows up and videotapes them, and then a survey comes through email or the US mail a few weeks later, that's not really a way of establishing a connection or building a rapport with them. So one of the things we've changed is there's now a sort of interview as part of doing the fall observations, which is designed in part to help people get acquainted with the study, but also to sort of build some rapport and let people know we're interested in their perspective and not just sort of this effort by researchers to collect data and not be hearing from them. Again, this picks up on a little bit what Vivian was raising. To focus on sociometric social networks with early care teachers, sociometric data collection is very resource intensive, and studies tend to have at the most 6 or 8 schools, or sometimes 10 or 12 schools. And if we took that approach with early care teachers, we might have a sample of 20 or 25 early care teachers. They tend to be distributed across schools. So we sort of have the tension here between wanting to have 125 or 150 study participants and being interested in their social context, but then relying on egocentric network data. Let me just see if you have any reactions or any suggestions for things we might be doing. So again, it's meant to help us think a little bit about if someone enters teaching, there's certainly the possibility that the relationship with the formal mentor really makes a difference, but there's often other things going on in the school environment that may drive their teaching or may drive other decisions. Okay, I'm going to finish my presentation by talking a little bit about a new study I'm working on that Julie alluded to. And I'll just acknowledge my colleagues here at UVA. In addition to Julie, Robert Berry is working with us on this, and some colleagues at Michigan State, Corey Drake and Spiros Konstantopoulos, as well as some colleagues at University of Connecticut, Dorothea Agnostopoulos and Tutita Costa. I had struggled with different members of this group for 4 or 5 years to try to get a longitudinal study of teacher prep funded. I think it appears that if you have 2 people of Greek descent on your PI team, that may help with the competitiveness of your proposal. But we also want to acknowledge our funders. The Curry Foundation provided a seed grant over a year ago, and we've been funded by the Spencer Foundation and the National Science Foundation. So what do we know about research on teacher preparation? In general, we've seen a number of studies that are small scale. They tend to focus on the experiences of teaching candidates in individual courses, or sometimes experiences just during the student teaching semester. These studies tend to focus on changes in teaching candidates or practicing teachers' beliefs or their instructional practices. Recently, we've begun to see some large-scale studies. Jim was directly involved with one of the most important ones, the New York City Pathways Study. It examined how preparation experiences are related to teacher effectiveness in the first 2 years. And in the last couple of years, we've seen a number of studies taking advantage of longitudinal data at the state level, and they've tried to compare different teacher preparation programs in the same state with regard to graduates' effects on student achievement. Generally, these studies, as they're being completed, the articles are coming out, they're finding not a lot of variation across most of the programs in their sample. Some of it's been done in Washington State, some in Missouri, some in North Carolina. It's finding there may be of 12 or 14 programs in a sample, one that really stands out as having a much stronger effect on producing effective teachers, and one program that might be much weaker. But in general, these studies are not finding a lot of variation across different teacher ed programs. So as a frame of reference, I worked with Julie and colleagues on what would be sort of a different way of asking a question for a longitudinal study of teacher prep, where we might not primarily be interested in the effects of the beginning teachers on student achievement, but maybe a more proximal outcome, sort of studying ways in which experiences in teacher prep or the candidate's own characteristics might be associated with their teaching practices. So in our study, we're focusing on 3 Research 1 institutions, as well as 3 large public institutions. All these programs train roughly from 50 to as many as 175 or 200 elementary candidates each year. We're going to sample roughly the same number of candidates and graduates from each of the 6 institutions and follow them into their second year of teaching. A number of characteristics of the study. I think a strength is that it focuses on multiple preparation programs. We are collecting data on individual characteristics of the teaching candidates. So we want to know some things about their own beliefs and knowledge with regard to teaching reading and teaching math. The study is primarily focused on opportunities to learn. So learning from the candidate's point of view. Did you have an opportunity to learn about the skill, to practice the skill, to apply the skill during student teaching? A second part of this, once the focal teachers become first and second year teachers, is to collect data on some of the resources as well as norms and expectations in their school. Go ahead.
Do you have questions about why teachers chose to go to specific schools?
Okay, thank you for asking that question. So one of the biggest issues in trying to do a study of a longitudinal study of teacher prep that includes more than one program is this issue of selection. What are some of the characteristics of individuals that are going into University A in the state of Michigan versus University B in the state of Michigan? We are not including alternate route programs, but the same thing could be asked if somebody included Teach for America or another alternate route program. So there's both the question of what are their characteristics, and then there's also the question of what's their motivation, what do they sort of see them, how are they viewing this in terms of a longer career path, that sort of thing. So we are not fully addressing that, but we have gotten a lot of feedback and criticism in the last few years as we've tried to get this study funded and get started with it, that you need to be thoughtful about this. So I would sort of say we are less focused on motivation for choosing a certain route into teaching or a certain program, and more really trying to collect data on 2 different types of characteristics. So one are some things that a lot of these well-done studies are collecting data on. This might be SAT, ACT, it might be selectivity of the institution that you're enrolled in. There are certainly things about gender, race, ethnicity of a candidate. So some basic measures of teacher characteristics that are probably really important. In our study, we're also interested in, as I mentioned, collecting information about the beliefs that the candidates have about teaching mathematics and using that as a way of looking at variation. It could be within a program. It might be that there's some differences across programs. So beliefs, identity, and also sort of the knowledge for teaching. That's sort of the second set of characteristics. Do you want to follow up a little bit? Do you know the magic answer to the question of how we study motivation to go into a different route? I mean, it's a great question. I think one of the challenges is at what stage are you collecting that data? Because you ideally would want to know something about it as people are starting or even choosing, and then you might need to collect data as well. And we're going to have to give more thought to that. We haven't really focused as much on sort of the motivation to choose as much as what are the characteristics of the individual.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's the descriptive wanting to know motivations, and I think, my guess is that probably the other methodological reason that people might have is if you wanted to make these comparisons between universities and between training programs, the thing that you would want to adjust for, right, is selection into these universities, and to have some kind of, if you're administering surveys, it seems like it might be a nice opportunity to collect some qualitative information to get a sense for how teachers are choosing so that you can evaluate whether the covariates that you have are sufficient.
So that's very helpful. So we'll make a mental note about that. As part of following the large sample for 2 years, we're going to more in-depth interview roughly 32 of the participants, and this would be a good place for that. And I'll go back to the fact that generally speaking, the 3 Research One institutions are similar institutions. So as we go into the study, we are making the assumption that there may be some similar characteristics among the candidates at those institutions, but that may be proven incorrect. And then the other institutions are a little bit less selective. They're large public teaching institutions. There may be some similarities across those 3 institutions with regard to some of these characteristics. Good. Natalia?
I was hoping that you could describe a little bit more what you mean by learning opportunities in university courses and student teaching, especially the student teaching piece, because I would imagine that that's going to vary a lot depending on the context in which the student is placed and how much autonomy they have to be able to demonstrate the, what do you call it, the ambitious
instruction, right.
And not necessarily something that they can control. And so I'm curious how you're sort of doing that piece.
Okay. So I'll back up and say, in some sense, we want to have some data from the program standpoint of what it will report to us it's offering. So we're going to collect some of this data by interviewing instructors of mathematics methods courses, instructors of reading language arts methods courses, and interviewing teacher ed program directors just to get from their sense what the program would say is being offered. We are collecting survey data from the university supervisors who work with the student teachers and the cooperating teachers who they're assigned to also get some sense of what the expectations are for the teaching candidates, what sort of opportunities there are to teach. But it's a great question. So we started with our 2 observation tools. We're using Plato, which Julie helped develop as a way of collecting data on reading language arts. And Robert and Sarah and others developed the mathematics scan, MScan, as an observation tool to collect data on mathematics. And we're looking in our questions about their experiences for the teaching candidates in methods courses and the experience the teaching candidates have in the student teaching placements about opportunities to practice some of the same instructional strategies or approaches that are emphasized by the tools. Am I addressing your question? Okay. So we're happy to share sort of quick summary versions of Plato and MScan or to share our survey, but the key there was really making those aligned. And you're absolutely right. It may be that as a function of high stakes testing, as a function of a sort of domineering cooperating teacher, there may be limited opportunities for a number of these folks during student teaching. Yeah, so the timing of administering the survey and then how that's related to when they're doing the student teaching. Jim?
I'm wondering, you sort of alluded to this earlier on another one of the studies that you're doing, but it's this within versus across variation. So it's the notion that one of the things that I think we found was that there was enormous variation within the teachers of a particular prep program. And it then becomes really hard to parse out whether that's something about that individual or something about the specific experiences that individual might have had. You know, some professor might have been terribly more effective than another. And so I'm wondering how you sort of parse out learning. I mean, this is one of the things that really, I think, ended up, and Julie lived this, and so she might have a different take, but I think I found sort of frustrating that, for example, Julie collected a ton of information on these 18 different teacher preparation programs in New York City. That didn't work so well when we tried to look at what worked much better was the survey data we collected. But then if that's the level at which you're operating, you're beginning to wonder, is this more about the people? It goes back to Vivian's question. Is it more about the people that you have or about the preparation experience? And I think we found it challenging to talk a lot about the preparation experience. And so I'm wondering how you guys have sort of thought about that issue.
Right. So as we go into the study, I think we have the small hope, but we're trying to be cautious, that there may be some characteristics of at least some of the programs that really seem to be associated with development of ambitious instruction in at least one content area, or maybe some experiences in one program or a couple programs, and the pattern is that almost all the candidates teach ambitiously within 2 years in both content areas. But you folks, as well as your colleagues, have sort of wrestled with this very challenging issue. I think one of the ways we've thought about it is because we're putting a lot of emphasis on the measures of math knowledge for teaching and reading knowledge and these additional items that get at some things about beliefs associated with teaching math, beliefs associated with teaching reading, that we're probably going to run into something similar to what happened in the New York City Pathway study, that a lot of it has to do with individual. Vivian's making good points about we want to make sure we're looking at motivation and the reasons for being in the program, how that's contributing to it. But it may be that this study can provide some insight into is it by having strong math knowledge for teaching that contributes, at least in one program, but maybe across a couple different programs, to taking advantage of certain opportunities? Or is it by some other patterns with beliefs with regard to teaching reading or beliefs with regard to teaching math, interacting with certain opportunities? So even if we can't say whether we identify them or not, one or two programs are having this association or this possible effect, is it something about the interaction between certain of these characteristics which might push programs to collect data on those characteristics or to consider them when they're admitting people as they come into the program? I'm actually going to give Julie the opportunity if you want to add anything to that or if you see it differently.
Learning to teach two different subjects, so to some extent we can capitalize on within-person cross-subject variability, and that say if someone has similar knowledge about reading and math when they enter a program and they end up being able to teach math much better than reading, that might be a particularly interesting case where we can go back and trace that individual's opportunities to learn in those two subjects in preparation to see if we can begin developing hypotheses about whether or not there are specific structures or sequences of opportunities in a specific content area. So I think that's something that's kind of unique about the study.
Just one other thought, it goes back to Vivian's point that I'm not sure I can see this both sides of this issue. I think you want to worry about it both ways, but it sounds like you are. But this notion of selection is part of what programs do, right?
Right.
So I'm not sure you want to control for that, right? It's sort of, if you can be smart about who you select into your program, that puts you much further ahead in terms of the preparation that you're doing. And so it seems to me good programs are smart about selection in the same way they're smart about preparation.
And that is sort of an argument for then making some effort to understand some things about mission of a given program, sort of approach in recruiting candidates.
I'd love to know more about how programs select who fits into their program. I mean, I have this very, so call me an economist for being sort of dismal about my expectations on this, but I have low expectations about what actually goes on in terms of selection in the teacher-ed program. So I'd love to be dissuaded of that view.
Yep. And I think that is like a useful direction for us to be thinking about that with each of these sites. You know, can we learn more about selection?
I know there's a study called case study in teacher education, which has measured learning opportunities in university courses from different sources with observation surveys and interviews, and maybe I think it can be very useful for you at that point at least.
Yeah, and what's the name of the study?
Case study is conducted by Karen Hammernes
Okay.
and Kirsti Klette from Norway, and it can be very useful for you, I think.
That's great. And there's Karen was also part of the New York City Pathway study, so there's a nice connection there. Go ahead, Sarah.
So I'm so curious if you've thought about ways of getting at teachers' ability to manage their classroom, both their sense of efficacy around that and then how that actually plays out when they get into the classroom and whether that's a part of that.
Right. Okay. So this is a little bit of a, I wouldn't say blind spot, but sort of an area where we place less emphasis. I think one thing that Julie and Robert would argue is that as part of collecting data on reading language arts and math instruction, we are interested in sort of how the observation tools help us understand the classroom environment that the teacher creates and sort of their ability to facilitate classroom discussion in that environment. It's sort of not a primary part of the tools or the focus of what we're looking at in the study, but it is something that's addressed by the observation tools, and so I think to some extent we'll be collecting data on it. Do you want to comment on how Plato addresses that?
So we have two scales in Plato, time management and behavior management, and they're not as nuanced as the scales in the class. And how we typically use them are as control variables, so that like if there is a reasonable level of time management and behavior management, that we would expect to see the other, what we're calling ambitious instructional practices, that facilitates the enactment of those ambitious instructional practices.
We are hoping to collect video recorded data for almost all the 150 teachers. It may be that we're able to do that for 100 of them or 125 of them, just because of their district policy, or some individuals may say, I'm willing to stay in your study, but I prefer that you just conduct live observations. To the extent that we're able to collect video data, I think one nice thing there is it would allow us to use a third observation tool and to look more directly at some of these other issues. So. We should talk further. That's a great suggestion. See if you have a few other questions. Okay, this just sort of walks through our design. I've been alluding to some of this. So in the first year of the study, we're focusing on teaching candidates who are in their final year of teacher preparation. We were interested in just administering 3 surveys to them. There's a well-developed measure of reading knowledge for teaching. It only applies to grades K through 3, and many of the people who are in the study may take jobs or do student teaching or both at grades 4 and 5. So we're actually administering 2 different measures that get at either reading knowledge for teaching, or the second one is ELA, pedagogical content knowledge. Natalia, did you want to?
I know you talked about this possibility of your 3 institutions being more similar and then your other 3 institutions being more similar.
Yep.
I also would be interested in knowing the populations that these schools serve. So where are those teachers going to, and potentially the needs of those
Right.
environments? Because I would imagine students going to a high poverty, high level,
Right.
would need very particular type of training.
Yeah.
That extends beyond just the really great instructional practices, conceptual practices.
Right. Okay, so the general point, this is something that has come up with our advisory panel and with reviewers of our proposal, and that is, are you just generally looking at how people learn to teach ambitiously, or are you looking at how they learn to teach ambitiously if they're in a high poverty setting, if they have high percentage of ELL students? So I think it's one of the things that the observation tools allow us to look at to some extent. They take account of some of these issues about teacher in a classroom, addressing equity, teacher in a classroom, individualizing learning. In terms of what you're getting at specifically, one of the 6 universities is in a major urban area, and by definition is drawing a fair amount of its student body, its teaching candidates from in and around that city, and then roughly 40–50%, a good percentage, will start teaching in that urban area or near there. The others are mostly university towns. They may have a population of 25 or 50,000, they may have a population of 100 or 150,000, but they're smaller communities. So this is a really important issue to look at. It's not consistent across the 6 institutions. I have 15 minutes, great. So this gives you a sense of what we plan to do in the 2nd or 3rd year. I've alluded to this a little bit. We would continue administering the same surveys. The goal when the participants are in their 1st and 2nd year is to observe them once in the fall, once in the winter, once in the spring while they're teaching math, and to also observe them once in the fall, once in the winter, once in the spring while they're teaching reading. We're planning to do each of those sort of back-to-back. The participant would get observed teaching math and reading either the same day or within 1 or 2 days. The design calls for collecting data on formal mentors, instructional coaches, and principals. At this point, I haven't talked my colleagues into collecting social network data, but we are getting data that gives us some sense of norms and expectations in the school context. See if you want to raise any questions about that. What else would you add to this design? I think I mentioned in reference to one of the questions that we're going to interview a subsample of the 150 participants to sort of learn in depth about factors that affect their teaching and how they negotiate the school context they're in. But is there something you would add to this, or that you think we're missing? responses. Okay. So I just want to bring out a few key characteristics of our study, and I'll wrap up by talking about some of the challenges we're facing. Julie alluded to this, but I think a strength of the study is the focus on 2 subjects. This allows us to potentially look at patterns in an individual's teaching practice, but also patterns and possible influences on their teaching practice in 2 areas. So we think a real important part of focusing on preparation of elementary teachers is the fact that elementary teachers have a significant role in shaping students' academic and life outcomes. We know that from research. A strength is the use of these observation tools. There's been a lot of research with these tools, and they're reliable, valid instruments. And we think a strength is the sample of the institutions. So very sharp audience. You've already identified a number of our challenges. The first one, selection effects, which we've been talking about. So a big challenge in research like this is also teacher attrition. Not everyone who gets trained to become a teacher becomes a teacher, or at least becomes a teacher right away. And we are focusing on people who are in elementary teacher ed programs, but many people in an elementary teacher ed program might be getting an endorsement or dual certification in special education. Or they might be getting trained to teach grades 1 through 8, and they might become a middle school teacher. So there's the issue of people going into teaching after completing a teacher ed program. There's the question of people staying in teaching through 2 years. There's some attrition in those first 2 years. And there's also the challenge of people starting in our study and becoming K through 5 teachers, but not remaining in our study. So the advice from Kim Grossman when she was here a few weeks ago is get a large number of candidates from each of these institutions in the study in the first year, and then be prepared for some of them not going into teaching or losing some people from your study. We have a challenge in terms of the variation that many of these teaching candidates will have, especially in the area of mathematics. So there's no one approach to becoming an elementary teacher. In some universities, you may take a couple university-level math courses. There may be other universities where you don't take any math before you go into your education courses. And so we're looking for ways to try to learn about that variation and measure it. It may be really relevant. I think a challenge for Julie, Robert, our other colleagues is using these observation tools in grades K through 2. They've basically been developed and used in upper elementary, and to some extent, Plato's been used at the middle school level. We are anticipating that many of these program graduates, they're from universities in Michigan, Connecticut, and Virginia, will stay in these 3 states. We are not, in terms of our budget, ready to send a grad student out to Hawaii to collect data on any of these folks, but some of these folks may be in North Carolina, they may be in Pennsylvania, they may be in New Jersey or in Ohio, so we have to sort of look for ways to follow people wherever they're teaching. And I've also alluded to this already, we don't anticipate being able to video record all the participants, and so there'll be some challenges. See if you want to raise any questions about this or just about the talk in general. David?
How about selecting the 150? How do you go about that?
So a few of the institutions are small enough in terms of the number of elementary candidates, meaning about 50 or 60 people graduate each year, that our approach is going to be for that institution. We are going to try to recruit everyone from that cohort to be in the study, with the assumption that if we start with roughly 50 people at institution A, 40 or 45 might choose to be in the study, and then for various reasons, some won't take a teaching job or some won't be teaching K through 5. So we feel pretty clear about the institutions with the smaller cohorts. 2 of the institutions in our study, and it helps us, have between 150 to 200 elementary graduates every year. They're training lots of elementary teachers. So we're going to randomly select some number of them, and in the case of the institution with 200, we may randomly select as many as 100 or 125 for this very reason that we expect some of them not to participate or not to be teaching K through 5. Does that answer your question? Okay. Jim?
So things may have changed since we did the work in New York, but we had difficulty getting programs to be able to identify whether somebody would be graduating. And that seems almost ridiculous, but it was most programs, because we wanted to do survey work of when these people were in their program. And most programs couldn't give us a list of the people who would graduate in May.
And it's a real comment on teacher education that people are just going through and taking courses piecemeal, and at some point there'll probably be some student teaching, but they might graduate 2 years from now, or they might be graduating last month. Yeah, so great comment. So with these institutions, we're sort of in the process of identifying final year teachers. I'd say for the first institution, first 2 of the 6, they're smaller in terms of David's question, about 50 to 60, and for whatever reason, it's sort of a cohort-based program. People are going through roughly at the same time period. The two institutions in particular that are much larger, I think there's going to potentially be a big issue there, and we have to sort of be clear that we're focusing on people who are doing student teaching at a certain point and are most likely graduating at the end of the school year when they're student teaching. But I appreciate you raising this, because it could be that someone student teaches and a year and a half later they're finishing, and that's going to affect us a little bit. But I appreciate you raising it. Also, that's just a very telling comment on teacher preparation.
We didn't prepare well enough for that because we just thought, well, of course they'll know, and they didn't. And so we would have done things a little differently, and leading up to that point, if we had that sense.
Other questions, reactions? I'll go to Sarah. Yeah.
That, for example, you know, like if you look at a teacher teaching fractions, you're going to learn different things about that teacher than if you're teaching about this value.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you thought of just a way of actually gathering what content is that you're teaching for some sort of other analysis about this. You could separate out the content compared to the process.
Yeah, so great point. So first of all, we will learn things about sort of the particular lesson, but also the unit that it's a part of. We're in a position where there's very likely to be differences across grades, because we're going to have participants across grades. But I think a very interesting question will be when we sort of limit the sample to the fourth grade teachers, or we, in some sense, try to limit it to teaching certain topics. You know, do we begin to see any patterns there? Because it may very well be that certain things in the math curriculum lend themselves to teaching ambitiously and others don't. So it's an important point. I think we're going to be restricted a little bit just with our ends, because these won't all be fourth grade teachers, or they won't all be teaching sort of the same curriculum. Vicki?
Yeah, are you assuming that all of the teachers are going to be teaching both homework and math? Because I know as you move up in grades, some teachers
Right. Yeah. I think our guess is if we're able to have roughly 150 participants, that most of them, but that could be 2/3, 100, maybe 125, will teach both. I think it's a very distinct possibility that some of the people in our study will just be teaching one or the other. And I think related to that, one of the things that we're interested in looking at is, as you go through your teacher prep program at some of these institutions, despite taking a math methods course, maybe there's no focus on that when you're student teaching. And we need to be aware of that and what that might mean for what we're looking at. Great question. Other questions at this point? So I hope I've convinced you to be open to the role of social context and looking at teacher development. Another question.
So, thinking about social networks, that's a place in literature I don't really know much, so this is kind of an obvious question. Please excuse me. So, thinking about the way in which this would influence this ambitious practice, I guess I have a question about kind of the permeability of the social network, especially for incoming teachers. Have you all had a chance, or is it common to actually analyze phone race identification of a teacher entering a school, so the racial composition of that school faculty, or the general experience level of the faculty?
Yeah.
I just have some questions about how those would influence the extent to which a new teacher could come in and adapt to the social network.
Right.
And fit it around.
Right. So very good question. In the previous study, one of the things that we were interested in, we just didn't find a lot of variation, was if there is differences in terms of race, or there are differences in terms of some other distinct characteristics of the teacher and people in their immediate social network, or there's also the question of just differences between the teacher and the principal, the person who's evaluating them and has formal responsibility. Is that driving that? We looked at it a little bit qualitatively in the study in beginning teacher commitment and retention, but it really wasn't something we found we had a lot of variation in, and could look at thoughtful way quantitatively. I think there's the question of sort of teachers' race and how that's related to who they establish informal relationships with and how comfortable they feel sort of in a given school context. The point about experience level is a really good one. It's not something we have mainly focused on. There's well done research by Susan Moore Johnson and colleagues. It's mostly qualitative data, but one of the questions that they looked at is what's the difference as you're entering teaching if you join a faculty that's primarily inexperienced? It might be a charter school, might otherwise be a school where many of the faculty are inexperienced, and what are the implications for resources, for mentoring, for things like that? And they compared that to other types of schools that in different ways are more characterized by a distribution of experience levels or a certain number of experienced teachers. So it's definitely relevant for sort of opportunities for early career teachers. Yep. So I think on that note, we may be finished. Is there anything else? Yeah. Thank you very much.